Well, this weekend, we celebrate the 94th anniversary of the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who died then from an assassin's bullet in 1968 when he was 39 years old. For reference, that's something like 6 years longer that Jesus of Nazareth is believed to have lived. Martin graduated from high school at 15, earned his undergraduate degree at the prestigious Black College Morehouse, from which his father and grandfather had both graduated. He went on to earn his theology degree from Crozier, a Baptist seminary, where one of his professors was Morton Scott Enslin, the same New Testament professor that I later had here at the theological school at St. Lawrence. With a fellowship he received from Crozier, Martin earned his PhD from Boston University, where his dissertation was a comparison of the conception of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Now, Wyman was a Unitarian theologian, which may be why Martin, while he was in Boston, went to the Unitarian Association's headquarters to explore the possibility of his becoming a Unitarian minister. Frederick May Elliott, the president of the association at the time, discouraged King, saying that as a Black man, it was unlikely that he could land a Unitarian pulpit. That was probably fortunate for the nation, because I doubt Martin could have had the impact he did had he been traveling in Unitarian circles. In 1954, Martin became the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and by this time he was already a national board member of the NAACP. In 1955, he received national attention as the leader of the bus boycott in Montgomery. And in 1957, he became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King was arrested more than 20 times over the years for leading nonviolent demonstrations for civil rights. In 1963, during one of these incarcerations, he wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. Then later that year, he led 250,000 people on the peaceful March on Washington, at which he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. That phrase was actually not in his manuscript, but the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who knew him well and was on the platform, called out to him mid-speech, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He departed from his manuscript, and the rest is history. Later that year, Time magazine named him its Man of the Year, and the next year he received the Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest person ever to get it. In 1965, he was a major force behind the passage of the Bipartisan Voting Rights Act. Remember that? We used to have one. In 1967, King delivered an address at Riverside Church in New York City for the clergy and laity concerned about the war in Vietnam. His title was "Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence." I commend that address to you. I just reread it this week again. It's on the internet, and I think actually there's also recording. Among the important observations that King shared that night was this: a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion, he said, is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And then he went on to say, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. and he called for the end to the Vietnam War. This address, seen by many as actually a significant contribution to the ending of the Vietnam War, marked the end of Dr. King's popularity. People were furious that he was straying from what they saw as his mission, civil rights for people of color, a mission which was much narrower than King's vision. It was a year after that address, almost to the day, when he was preparing for the Poor People's March on Washington and was in Memphis on behalf of striking garbage collectors, that he was assassinated. I will not belabor the circumstances, but his wife, following the trial of the man that many believed to have been significantly involved in the assassination, wrote, "The jury was clearly convinced by the extensive evidence that was presented during the trial that in addition to Mr. Jowers, the conspiracy of the mafia, local, state, and federal government agencies, the FBI and the CIA, were deeply involved in the assassination of my husband. The jury also affirmed overwhelming evidence that identified someone else, not James Earl Ray, as the shooter, and that Mr. Ray was simply set up to take the blame." While he had been considered a popular, heroic figure for his leadership of the struggle for human rights, Ibram X. Kendi asserts in his superb article in the October Atlantic magazine, worth digging up, he says, the second assassination of King began days after the first assassination. Almost a third of Americans polled in April 1968 felt that King himself was to blame for his assassination, felt that he had brought it on himself. When King was killed, he was one of the most hated people in the United States. Nearly half of Black Americans and 3/4 of white Americans disapproved of him when he stepped out onto that motel balcony. Death threats were a fact of his life. Kendi went on to write, King's first assassinations professed to hate him half a century ago. His second assassins professed to revere him. Death threats to King's legacy are now sold as love songs to the legacy, and King is adored in death. Literally, King is still hated in life. When he reluctantly signed the bill creating the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday, Ronald Reagan declared that the holiday was actually based on an image, not reality, which leads into the central theme of this sermon, myth and history. Ibram Kendi points out that historians and writers have called attention again and again and again to the misappropriation of King, the misunderstanding of King, the stealing of King, the attempts to defang King, the watering down of King, and the whitewashing of King by the conservators of racial inequity. He points to Josh Mandela, Republican candidate for the US Senate, who told the crowd what the liberals are doing by advancing the cause of critical race theory. They're stomping on the grave of Martin Luther King. This is a charge repeated by many Republican politicians. His modern day assassins endlessly recite King's dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, as if that was all that King said during his 1963 March on Washington speech. They disregard all the lines before it and after it when King lamented that his dream was being thwarted by vicious racists in places sweltering with the heat of oppression. King told an NBC News correspondent on May 8, 1967, that the dream I had in 1963 has at many points turned into a nightmare. Kendi says, it was this nightmare of post-civil rights racial inequality that caused local legal scholars in the 1970s to develop critical race theory in law schools, particularly to study and to reveal the law's role in the maintenance of inequality. Kendi concludes his article in The Atlantic, quoting the story of Joseph in the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis 37, 19 to 21. Joseph's brothers said to one another, "Behold, here comes the dreamer. Let us slay him, and we shall see what becomes of his dream." It is those engaged in utilizing critical race theory who are working today to advance the fulfillment of King's dream. I don't know about you, but I had never heard of critical race theory, commonly abbreviated as CRT, until September of 2020, actually, when the then occupant of the White House, I can't remember his name, I've repressed it, issued an executive order calling for the end of diversity training because of its basis in critical race theory. He said, critical race theory is a Marxist doctrine that rejects the vision of Martin Luther King Jr. Reportedly, the danger that that theory represents to so much of what that office holder stood for was called to his attention by a right-wing filmmaker and evangelist, Christopher Rufo, a senior fellow at the conservative Manhattan Institute who'd been with a number of conservative organizations before. If you watch Fox News, I won't ask you to raise your hand, CRT was mentioned more than 3,900 times in the year 2021, always negatively. Tucker Carlson calls it a cult. Miranda Devine says that it's designed to warp the minds of American children. Newt Gingrich insists that CRT is intended to brainwash our kids. One of the most complete descriptions of what CRT is not, but is charged with being, can be found in Rufo's Critical Race Theory Briefing book, in which he asserts critical race theory is an academic discipline that holds that the United States is a nation founded on white supremacy and oppression, and that these forces are still at the root of our society. Critical race theorists believe that American institutions, such as the Constitution and legal system, preach freedom and equality, but are mere camouflages for naked racial domination. They believe that racism is a constant universal condition. It simply becomes more subtle, sophisticated, and insidious over the course of history. In simple terms, critical race theory, he says, reformulates the old Marxist dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed, replacing the class categories of bourgeoisie and proletariat with the identity categories of white and black. Now, there is a grain of truth in all that, but Rufo proceeds then to go off the deep end. He asserts that CRT teaches that all whites are racist. Individuals categorized as white are inherently responsible for injustice and oppression committed by white populations in the past, that we must reject the principle of equality under the law, and that critical race theorists believe that society should work to abolish the white race. Rufo advocates the adoption of language that is trenchant, persuasive, and resonates with the public, using phrases such as race-based Marxism, state-sanctioned racism, and racial engineering. He insists that in schools, children are being taught that they are defined by their race, not as individuals, and that they should hate each other and hate their country. Rufo has tweeted, We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic. The goal is to have the people read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Now, while we might be tempted to file this stuff in a trash can full of crackpot ideas, the reality is that today, 21 Republican state legislatures have considered or are considering bills that would outlaw any teaching resembling CRT. Nothing should be taught, some say, that would make any child ever feel uncomfortable. In Tennessee, they're proposing to levy fines beginning at $1 million on school districts in which a teacher willingly violates prohibitions on discussing white privilege, racism, or sexism in class. School boards are being attacked by parents and by activists who have no kids, who want no mention of the principles of CRT in any classroom. It's being proposed that teachers should be required to wear body cameras so their teaching can be monitored. Now, actually, some teachers have said that would be wonderful to have that kind of parental involvement. We'd like to have them know what we're trying to do. Why should we take this seriously? Because there is ground being fertilized by this horse manure. The progressive broadcaster Tom Hartman points out to the millions who are convinced that there's an international conspiracy funded by Jews to replace European ancestry whites with people of color whose ancestors came from outside of Europe. They're frightened, he says, by the new census data showing that whites are a decreasing majority in America, and they're terrified by the prospect that Afghans who risk their lives for America might actually move here. Hartman goes on to assert that the source of their terror is their totally wrong and unscientific belief that skin color is a reliable indicator of temperament, intelligence, and trustworthiness. Therefore, they believe skin color must always determine who has political, cultural, and economic power in America. Many are willing to take up arms and kill others to defend their right to live in an exclusively white-controlled region or country. They're in police departments across the country. They form heavily armed militia groups primed for a race war in America, and they occupy about 1 in every 3 residences in any random white neighborhood across the country. Now, I do hope, and I believe that Hartman is somewhat off in his estimate of their prevalence, but such racists certainly do exist and are a threat to the principles which our nation has articulated. What actually is critical race theory then, and where did it come from? One of the terrible things about cultures is that they have a tendency to blame the victim, and it's sadly effective at even convincing victims of their own responsibility for their conditions. A number of Black scholars in the 70s and 80s began to ask why it was the passage of civil rights legislation had had so little actual impact on the lives of Black Americans. After all that legislation, Blacks were and still are at the bottom of all of the measures of social well-being. Harvard Law School professor Derek Bell is given the title of forefather of CRT. He insists he's received more credit than he deserves for the movement's origins. Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor of law both at Columbia and at the University of California, insists that CRT is a way of seeing and thinking about race that denaturalizes racial inequality. CRT, she says, takes seriously the idea that race is not a biological difference. There are not inherent differences in how people across races are constituted. Race is not real, she says. It's socially constructed. Now that race is not real is a big step to digest. I would have some difficulty in dismissing race so totally were it not for a superb SOAR class I took at SUNY Potsdam, taught by Dr. Nasser Malik, a member of its anthropology department, who in fact spoke from this pulpit a couple of years ago. I have neither the time, authority, nor the data to effectively make the argument for the insignificance of race as powerfully as he did. But what he taught goes directly to the content of our children's story. The skin I'm in looks good to me. It will let you know one small way to trace my identity. But then again, the skin I'm in will always be just a covering. It cannot tell my story. If you want to know who I am, you have got to come inside. Be with me inside the me of me. In that place where skin is again one small way to see me, but not real enough to be all the me of me or the you of you. For we are all inside made of real history, real dreams, and the stuff of all we hope for when we can be all real together on the inside. So critical race theory demands that we look in a different way at our nation's history, in a more critical way, a more thorough way, not as we customarily have just from the white perspective. The New York Times 1619 Project was a shot across the bow of our conventional thinking about the role of race in American history. It shook some of the comforting beliefs we in the white majority have held. As I said in a sermon when it first came out, I did not and still do not read that project as being anti-white. What it did was fill in some significant gaps in my knowledge of American history. And the newly published book expanding on the project goes into much more depth. There is no consensus as to whether the first Africans were deposited on these shores in 1619, a year before the Mayflower, were viewed as slaves or indentured servants. But by 1662, Maryland enacted a law requiring all Negroes and other slaves to serve for the duration of their lives. A 1672 Virginia law was called an Act for the Apprehension and Suppression of Runaway Negroes and Slaves. That law gave immunity to any white person who killed or wounded a runaway person of color while in pursuit of them. This was the origin of that qualified immunity principle, which has hung up congressional approval of police reform today. Our police forces can readily be traced back to the slave patrols. I was not aware, I don't know if you are, of the clause in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence that was deleted in the final version. Jefferson wrote, "King George has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither." Actually, Jefferson wrote later that that clause was removed by the Continental Congress in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia. Our northern brethren also, I believe, he said, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people had very few slaves themselves, yet they'd been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. New York City had one of the largest slave markets in the nation. Historian Clyde W. Ford points to Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's 1857 opinion for the majority in the Dred Scott case, in which he opined, "Blacks have no rights which the white man is bound to respect." Keep in mind that when Social Security was enacted, farm workers and domestic employees, occupations that encompass significant numbers of Black folk, were excluded at the insistence of Southern members of Congress. Also, the GI Bill of Rights, which helped so many veterans obtain homes after World War II, effectively excluded veterans of color through redlining. Nor did the educational opportunities provided white vets include many vets of color. Bringing it right up to today, FEMA has only just now changed its requirements for aid to people who have lost their homes in disasters. Black folk often passed property on to subsequent generations without formal legal documentation, which meant that many Black families were denied assistance because they didn't have the right paperwork. FEMA is now in the process of liberalizing the required documentation of ownership. These legal sources of discrimination have meant that Black families have been denied access to many of the means of acquiring wealth, not to mention the educational deprivation that has followed from separate and not equal segregated schools. And do keep in mind the statistics that show that a Black child today is no more likely to be in an integrated classroom than they were prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. Were you taught in school about the massacres in Greenwood in Missouri in 1921 or Rosewood in Florida, both successful Black communities that whites considered threatening? Or Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, Opelousas, Louisiana, 1868, Atlanta, 1906, Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, Ocoee, Florida, 1920. Today, mob lynchings have been replaced by the mass incarceration of Blacks by women and men in Black judicial robes who achieve the same result by pretending to act under the color of law. These racial realities have not generally been a part of our American history curricula. One of the most fascinating articles I encountered in my research for the sermon was one I found on the History News Network, reprinted from The Root, a Black periodical. Researchers looked into the history of the education of many of the leading Republican opponents of critical race theory. The article notes that when Mitch McConnell and 38 Republican senators sent a letter to the Secretary of Education decrying the ghastly prospect of white students having to learn actual facts about slavery, it was not unexpected. For centuries, this country's schools have perpetuated a whitewashed version of history that either erases or reduces the story of Black America down to a B plot in the American script. It's why they hate critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and anything factual, because the article says the white-centric interpretation of our national past is so commonly accepted, white people have convinced themselves that anything that varies from the Caucasian myths must be a lie. As I said, they investigated what history texts various Republican leaders were exposed to as high school students. Marsha Blackburn, the Republican from Tennessee, attended high school in Laurel, Mississippi, where the history text was John K. Butterworth's Mississippi, a History, which asserted that slave masters treated their slaves as their own, but noted that most of the human chattel were so lazy that it took two to help, one to do nothing. That text treats Brown v. Board as a travesty, insisting that most Mississippians were satisfied with segregated schools. Representative Blackburn asserts the 1619 Project is nothing more than left-wing propaganda. Tennesseans don't want to see it in our schools. We want our children to learn about our nation's history. Left unsaid is our nation's history just the way we learned about it. Tom Cotton, the Republican from Arkansas, insists that the 1619 Project is left-wing propaganda. It's revisionist history at its worst. His high school history text was The American Pageant, in which the war for Southern independence is depicted as being just about tariffs. The book does not quote any of the state declarations of secession, which make it explicit that slavery was the central issue in the war, noting only that the rebel Jefferson Davis told the despotic King Abraham Lincoln, "All we ask is to be let alone." Lindsey Graham's school in Pickens County, South Carolina, didn't desegregate until 1970, even though Brown v. Board was declared in 1955. The history text from which he was taught was the 1958 edition of the History of South Carolina, which declared most masters treated their slaves kindly. Africans were brought from a worse life to a better one. As slaves, they were trained in the ways of civilization. Above all, the landowners argued, the slaves were given the opportunity to become Christians in a Christian land instead of remaining in a savage country. The text praised the Klan for keeping justice alive during Reconstruction. The sight of the mounted Klansmen in their white robes was enough to terrorize the Negroes. The only Black person mentioned by name in that entire textbook was Denmark Vesey, who was executed for starting a slave revolt. There are more examples given, but you get the point. If you and I had gone through those schools and learned history in the way it has been taught in the South, and even frankly in much of the North, it would not be surprising that we would be offended by what so many are calling revisionist history, as if that's a bad thing. I distinctly remember that I was taught in my American history class at Albany High School that Reconstruction was a disaster because the former slaves were not prepared for voting and were exploited by carpetbaggers and scalawags. The History.com website reports that during and immediately after the Civil War, many Northerners headed to the Southern states driven by hopes of economic gain, a desire to work on behalf of the newly emancipated slaves, or a combination of both. These carpetbaggers, whom many in the South viewed as opportunists looking to exploit and profit from the region's misfortunes, supported the Republican Party and would play a central role in shaping new Southern governments during Reconstruction. The site goes on to say that in the 2 years following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln and the end of the Civil War in April 1865, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, angered many Northerners and Republican members of Congress with his conciliatory policies toward the defeated South. The new Southern legislatures even passed Black codes restricting their freedom and forcing Blacks into repressive labor situations, a development that they strongly resisted. In the congressional elections of 1866, Northern voters rejected Johnson's view of Reconstruction. That was not what I was taught. In fact, former slaves voted in amazing numbers and elected a significant number of their fellows to office. The laws that are being enacted to protect students from revisionist history have teachers and administrators and school boards concerned, wondering whether it will be safe to even mention the words race or slave or segregation in history classes. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founders of CIT, in a blog interview for the ACLU, talked about how hard it would be to address the problem of asbestos in our schools if we were not allowed to use the word asbestos. She points out it is equally impossible to envision doing anything to reduce the continuing impact in this country of racism if we cannot use the word race and have to live in fear of any kids feeling badly about honest portions of our history. I can't get my arms around yet around how ignorant I have been about the actual victory in the Civil War. While we in the North are taught that the Union won, in the South, that's a lot less clear. When we look at the actual history following Reconstruction, a good case can be made for the Old South having risen again without much interference from the federal government. Sharecropping is not the same as slavery, heaven knows, but when you come right down to the living of it, maybe the plantation owner actually made out with less responsibility than he had before. The Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act has resulted in the passage and the pending passage of scores of laws that are clearly designed to restore the Jim Crow restrictions for Black voting. All of this opens up the question of what is history? Is history that which is contained in the pages of a history textbook? Decisions always play a major role in what is included in those texts. And what do you do when historians learn more about what actually happened? Frank Fioretti, in his book, Mythical Past, Elusive Future, points out that for a long time, history has been a fragmented discipline. There's no history with a capital H. There are many competing histories. A lack of agreement about history reflects a lack of consensus today, and vice versa. Particularly disturbing for the guardians of established values is the realization that they can no longer assume that their version of the past will not be contested. How reliable a picture of what happened in the past do histories present? When George Floyd was killed, the initial police report said he was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. What if that were what historians relied on? It was only because of Darnella Fraser's videotaping that the truth eventually came to light. But even with that evidence, there are still many who believe that Derek Chauvin should not have been convicted of George Floyd's murder. If you look at the various articles which were being printed on the January 6th insurrection, you get radically different pictures of what happened that day, even though we have tons of videotape giving us a pretty clear message. What will history say? Well, then again, what do we really know about the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln or John Kennedy or Martin Luther King? Up close and farther away, we have a problem knowing for sure what actually happened. What we see, what is reported, what is recorded. One of the best teachers I had at Albany High School was my world history teacher, Elsa Troidel. Mrs. Troidel handed out the textbooks at the beginning of the year, and she said, here, take these, put them in your locker so you can give them back to me at the end of the year in the same shape I gave them to you. The challenge we faced every day was to go to the library and research the variety of explanations and descriptions of historical events. And wow, did we find a variety. We learned that real history is not something that's confined to the pages of a textbook. I wonder what impact Jewish and particularly Christian teachings have had on our ability to understand history. If we believe that the Bible contained actual history, as millions of people do, would that not dispose us to believe that textbooks full of myths should also be trusted? For many, biblical accounts are not debatable, even though they were recorded by biased sources and passed down over the millennia at the hands of others with a particular story to sell. This must impact our ability to view all history critically. I've always blanched at the phrase revisionist history. Would we want our physics not to be revised as we learned more? Would we want psychology not to be revised as we learn more about human nature? Would we want medicine not to be revised? Our understanding of the past is dependent upon information, and additions to that information require the revision of history. That's what critical race theory is about, trying to get to the root of what actually happened in our nation's history and the impact that that history has on our nation even today. CRT is about truth. It's about justice, about how real people were impacted by events. And those are the last things that people who are committed to the status quo want us to address. CRT is not about blaming contemporary individuals for the way things have been, white or black. Again, it's about the search for truth, painful though that may be. Leon Litwack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, has pointed out that few people have cared more deeply about this nation than some of its severest critics. We need to be wary of those who, in the name of protecting our freedoms, would diminish them. History teaches, after all, that it is not the rebels, the iconoclasts, the curious, the dissidents who endanger a democratic society, but rather the accepting, the unthinking, the unquestioning, the docile, the obedient, the silent, and the indifferent. Ibram X. Kendi addressed this in the conclusion to his book on anti-racism when he wrote, "Before we can treat the sickness of racism, we must believe. Believe all is not lost for you and me in our society. Believe in the possibility that we can strive to be anti-racist from this day forward. Believe in the possibility that we can transform our societies to be anti-racist from this day forward. Racist power is not godly. Racist policies are not indestructible. Racial inequities are not inevitable. Racist ideas are not natural to the human mind. Race and racism are powerful constructs of the modern world. Racism is one of the fastest spreading and most fatal cancers humanity has ever known. It's hard to find a place where its cancer cells are not dividing and multiplying. There's nothing," he said, "that I see in our world today, in our history, giving me hope. Hope that one day anti-racists will win the fight, that one day the flag of anti-racism will fly over a world of equity. What gives me hope," he said, "is a simple truism. Once we lose hope, we are guaranteed to lose. But if we ignore the odds and fight to create an anti-racist world, then we give humanity a chance to one day survive, a chance to live in communion, a chance to be forever free." What will become of Martin Luther King's dream, given that he's no longer with us? Well, it's in our hands.